Islamic art encompasses the visual arts produced from the 7th century onward by people who lived within the territory that was inhabited by or ruled by culturally Islamic populations. It is thus a very difficult art to define because it covers many lands and various peoples over some 1,400 years. It is not art specifically of a religion, or of a time, or of a place, or of a single medium like painting. The huge field of Islamic architecture is the subject of a separate article, leaving fields as varied as calligraphy, painting, glass, pottery, and textile arts such as carpets and embroidery. Islamic art is not at all restricted to religious art, but includes all the art of the rich and varied cultures of Islamic societies as well. It frequently includes secular elements and elements that are frowned upon, if not forbidden, by some Islamic theologians. Apart from the ever-present calligraphic inscriptions, specifically religious art is actually less prominent in Islamic art than in Western medieval art, with the exception of Islamic architecture where mosques and their complexes of surrounding buildings are the most common remains. Figurative painting may cover religious scenes, but normally in essentially secular contexts such as the walls of palaces or illuminated books of poetry. The calligraphy and decoration of manuscript Qur'ans is an important aspect, but other religious art such as glass mosque lamps and other mosque fittings such as tiles, woodwork and carpets usually have the same style and motifs as contemporary secular art, although with religious inscriptions even more prominent. Islamic art developed from many sources. Roman, early Christian art, and Byzantine styles were taken over in early Islamic art and architecture. The influence of the Sasanian art of pre-Islamic Persia was of paramount significance. Central Asian styles were brought in with various nomadic incursions, and Chinese influences had a formative effect on Islamic painting, pottery, and textiles. Though the whole concept of Islamic art has been criticized by some modern art historians, calling it a figment of imagination or a mirage, the similarities between art produced at widely different times and places in the Islamic world, especially in the Islamic Golden Age, have been sufficient to keep the term in wide use by scholars. There are repeating elements in Islamic art, such as the use of geometrical floral or vegetal designs in a repetition known as the arabesque. The arabesque in Islamic art is often used to symbolize the transcendent, indivisible and infinite nature of God. Mistakes in repetitions may be intentionally introduced as a show of humility by artists who believe only God can produce perfection. Although this theory is disputed, typically, though not entirely, Islamic art has focused on the depiction of patterns, whether purely geometric or floral, and Arabic calligraphy, rather than on figures, because it is feared by many Muslims that the depiction of the human form is idolatry and thereby a sin against God, forbidden in the Quran. Human portrayals can be found in all eras of Islamic art, above all in the more private form of miniatures, where their absence is rare. Human representation for the purpose of worship is considered idolatry and is duly forbidden in Islamic law, known as Sharia law. There are also many depictions of Muhammad, Islam's chief prophet, in historical Islamic art. Small decorative figures of animals and humans, especially if they are hunting the animals, are found on secular pieces in many media from many periods, but portraits were slow to develop. Calligraphy. Calligraphic design is omnipresent in Islamic art, whereas in Europe in the Middle Ages, religious exhortations, including Quranic verses, may be included in secular objects, especially coins, tiles and metalwork, and most painted miniatures include some script, as do many buildings. Other inscriptions include verses of poetry, and inscriptions recording ownership or donation. Two of the main scripts involved are the symbolic Kufic and Naskh scripts, which can be found adorning and enhancing the visual appeal of the wall walls and domes of buildings, the sides of minbars, and metalwork. Islamic calligraphy in the form of painting or sculptures are sometimes referred to as Quranic art. East Persian pottery from the 9th to 11th century is decorated only with highly stylized inscriptions, called epigraphic ware, has been described as probably the most refined and sensitive of all Persian pottery. Large inscriptions made from tiles, sometimes with the letters raised in relief, or the background cut away, are found on the interiors and exteriors of many important buildings. Complex carved calligraphy also decorates buildings. For most of the Islamic period, the majority of coins only showed lettering, which are often very elegant despite the small size and nature of production. The tufa monogram of an Ottoman sultan was used extensively on official documents with very elaborate decoration for important ones. Other single sheets of calligraphy, designed for albums, might contain short poems, Quranic verses, or other texts. The main languages, all using Arabic script, are Arabic, always used for Quranic verses, Persian in the Persianate world, especially for poetry, and Turkish, with Urdu appearing in later centuries. Calligraphers usually had a higher status than other artists. Painting. Although there has been a tradition of wall paintings, especially in the Persianate world, the best surviving and highest developed form of painting in the Islamic world is the miniature in illuminated manuscripts, or later as a single page for inclusion in a Muraka-bound album of miniatures and calligraphy. The tradition of the Persian miniature has been dominant since about the 13th century, strongly influencing the Ottoman miniature of Turkey and the Mughal miniature in India. Miniatures were especially an art of the court, and because they were not seen in public, it has been argued that constraints on the depiction of the human figure were much more relaxed, and indeed miniatures often contain great numbers of small figures, and from the 16th century portraits of single ones. Although surviving early examples are now uncommon, human figurative art was a continuous tradition in Islamic lands in secular contexts, notably several of the Umayyad desert castles, and during the Abbasid Caliphate. The largest commissions of illustrated books were usually classics of Persian poetry such as the epic Shahnameh, although the Mughals and Ottomans both produced lavish manuscripts of more recent history with the autobiographies of the Mughal emperors, and more purely military chronicles of Turkish conquests. Portraits of rulers developed in the 16th century, and later in Persia, then becoming very popular. Mughal portraits, normally in profile, are very finely drawn in a realist style, while the best Ottoman ones are vigorously stylized. Album miniatures typically featured picnic scenes, portraits of individuals or animals, or idealized youthful beauties of either sex. Chinese influences included the early adoption of the vertical format natural to a book, which led to the development of a bird's-eye view where a very carefully depicted background of hilly landscape or palace buildings rises up to leave only a small area of sky. The figures are arranged in different planes on the background, with recession indicated by placing more distant figures higher up in the space, but at essentially the same size. The colors, which are often very well preserved, are strongly contrasting, bright and clear. The tradition reached a climax in the 16th and early 17th centuries, but continued until the early 19th century, and has been revived in the 20th. Rugs and carpets. No Islamic artistic product has become better known outside the Islamic world than the pile carpet, more commonly referred to as the Oriental carpet. The versatility is utilized in everyday Islamic and Muslim life, from floor coverings to architectural enrichment, from cushions to bolsters to bags and sacks of all shapes and sizes, and to religious objects. They have been a major exponent export to other areas since the late Middle Ages, used to cover not only floors but tables. So long a widespread European practice that is now common only in the Netherlands. Carpet weaving is a rich and deeply embedded tradition in Islamic societies, and the practice is seen in large city factories as well as in rural communities and nomadic encampments. In earlier periods, special establishments and workshops were in existence that functioned directly under court patronage. Very early Islamic carpets, i.e., those before the 16th century, are extremely rare. More have survived in the West, and Oriental carpets in Renaissance painting from Europe are a major source of information on them, as they were valuable imports that were painted accurately. The most natural and easy designs for a carpet weaver to produce consist of straight lines and edges, and the earliest Islamic carpets to survive or be shown in paintings have geometric designs, or center on very stylized animals, made up in this way. Since the flowing loops and curves of the arabesque are central to Islamic art, the interaction and tension between these two styles was long a major feature of carpet design. There are a few survivals of the grand Egyptian 16th-century carpets, including one almost as good as new discovered in the attic of the Pitti Palace in Florence, whose complex patterns of octagon roundels and stars, in just a few colors, shimmer before the viewer. Production of this style of carpet began under the Mamluks but continued after the Ottomans conquered Egypt. The other sophisticated tradition was the Persian carpet, which reached its peak in the 16th and early 17th century in works like the Ardabal carpet and coronation carpet. During this century, the Ottoman and Mughal courts also began to sponsor the making in the domains of large formal carpets, evidently with the involvement of designers used to the latest court style in the general Persian tradition. These use a design style shared with non-figurative Islamic illumination and other media, often with a large central gul motif, and always with wide and strongly demarcated borders. The grand designs of the workshops patronized by the court spread out to smaller carpets for the merely wealthy and for export, and designs close to those of the 16th and 17th centuries are still produced in large numbers today. The description of older carpets has tended to use the names of carpet-making centers as labels, but often derived from the design rather than any actual evidence that they originated from around that center. Research has clarified that designs were by no means always restricted to the center they are traditionally associated with, and the origin of many carpets remains unclear. As well as the major Persian, Turkish and Arab centers, carpets were also made across Central Asia, in India, and in Spain and the Balkans. Spanish carpets, which sometimes interrupted typical Islamic patterns to include coats of arms, enjoyed high prestige in Europe, being commissioned by royalty and for the papal palace, Avignon, and the industry continued after the Reconquista. Armenian carpet weaving is mentioned by many early sources, and may account for a much larger proportion of East Turkish and Caucasian production than traditionally thought. The Berber carpets of North Africa have a distinct design tradition. Apart from the products of city workshops, in touch with trading networks that might carry the carpets to markets far away, there was also a large and widespread village and nomadic industry producing work that stayed closer to traditional local designs, as well as pile carpets, gulums and other types of flat weave or embroidered textiles were produced for use on both floors and walls. Figurative designs, sometimes with large human figures, are very popular in Islamic countries but relatively rarely exported to the West. where abstract designs are generally what the market expects. Ceramics. Islamic art has very notable achievements in ceramics, both in pottery and tiles for walls, which in the absence of wall paintings were taken to heights unmatched by other cultures. Early pottery is often unglazed, but tin opacified glazing was one of the earliest new technologies developed by the Islamic potters. The first Islamic opaque glazes can be found as blue-painted ware in Basra, dating to around the 8th century. Another significant contribution was the development of stone-paste ceramics, originating from 9th century Iraq. The first industrial complex for glass and pottery production was built in Ar-Raqqa, Syria, in the 8th century. Other centers for innovative pottery in the Islamic world included Fustat, Damascus and Tabriz. Lusterwares with iridescent colors may have continued pre-Islamic Roman and Byzantine techniques, but were either invented or considerably developed on pottery and glass in Persia and Syria from the 9th century onwards. Islamic pottery was often influenced by Chinese ceramics, whose achievements were greatly admired and emulated. This was especially the case in the periods after the Mongol invasions and those of the Timurids. Techniques, shapes and decorative motifs were all affected. Until the early modern period, Western ceramics had very little influence, but Islamic pottery was very sought after in Europe, and often copied. An example of this is the albarello, a type of maiolica earthenware jar originally designed to hold apothecaries' ointments and dry drugs. The development of this type of pharmacy jar had its roots in the Islamic Middle East. Hispano-Moresque examples were exported to Italy, stimulating the earliest Italian examples from 15th century Florence. The Hispano-Moresque style emerged in Al-Andalusia Muslim Spain in the 8th century, under Egyptian influence, but most of the best production was much later, by potters presumed to have been largely Muslim but working in areas reconquered by the Christian kingdoms. It mixed Islamic and European elements in its designs, and much was exported across neighboring European countries. It had introduced two ceramic techniques to Europe: glazing with an opaque white tin glaze, and painting in metallic lusters. Ottoman Islamic pottery produced most of the best work in the 16th century, in tiles and large vessels boldly decorated with floral motifs influenced, once again, by Chinese Yuan and Ming ceramics. These were still in earthenware. There was no porcelain made in Islamic countries until modern times, though Chinese porcelain was imported and admired. The medieval Islamic world also had pottery with painted animal and human imagery. Examples are found throughout the medieval Islamic world, particularly in Persia and Egypt, tiling the earliest grand Islamic buildings, like the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, had interior walls decorated with mosaics in the Byzantine style, but without human figures. For the 9th century onwards, the distinctive Islamic tradition of glazed and brightly colored tiling for interior and exterior walls and domes developed. Some earlier schemes create designs using mixtures of tiles, each of a single color, that are either cut to shape or are small and of a few shapes, used to create abstract geometric patterns. Later large painted schemes use tiles painted before firing with a part of the scheme, a technique requiring confidence in the consistent results of firing. Some elements, especially the letters of inscriptions, may be molded in three-dimensional relief, and especially in Persia, certain tiles in a design may have figurative painting of animals as single human figures. These were often part of designs mostly made up of tiles in plain colors, but with larger fully painted tiles at intervals. The larger tiles are often shaped as 8-pointed stars, and may show animals or a human head or bust, or plant or other motifs. The geometric geometric patterns, such as modern North African zellige work, made of small tiles each of a single color but different and regular shapes, are often referred to as mosaic, which is not strictly correct. The Mughals made much less use of tiling, preferring parchankari, a type of pietra dura decoration from inlaid panels of semi-precious stones, with jewels in some cases. This can be seen at the Taj Mahal, Agra Fort and other imperial commissions. The motifs are usually floral in a simpler and more realistic style than Persian or Turkish work, relating to plants in Mughal miniatures. Glass. For most of the Middle Ages, Islamic glass was the most sophisticated in Eurasia, exported to both Europe and China. Islam took over much of the traditional glass-producing territory of Sasanian and ancient Roman glass, and since figurative decoration played a small part in pre-Islamic glass, the change in style is not abrupt, except that the whole area initially formed a political whole, and, for example, Persian innovations were now almost immediately taken up in Egypt. For this reason, it is often impossible to distinguish between the various centers of production, of which Egypt, Syria and Persia were the most important, except by scientific analysis of the material, which itself has difficulties. From various documentary references, glassmaking and glass trading seems to have been a speciality of the Jewish minority in several centers. Between the 8th and early 11th centuries, the emphasis in luxury glass is on effects achieved by manipulating the surface of the glass, initially by incising into the glass on a wheel, and later by cutting away the background to lever design in relief. The very massive headwork glasses, only found in Europe, but normally considered Islamic, are an example of this, though puzzlingly late in date. These and other glass pieces probably represented cheaper versions of vessels of carved rock crystal, themselves influenced by earlier glass vessels, and there is some evidence that at this period glass cutting and hard stone carving were regarded as the same craft. From the 12th century, the industry in Persia and Mesopotamia appears to decline, and the main production of luxury glass shifts to Egypt and Syria, and decorative effects of color on smooth-surfaced glass. Throughout the period, local centers made simpler wares such as Hebron glass in Palestine, luster painting, by techniques similar to lusterware in pottery, dates back to the 8th century in Egypt, and became widespread in the 12th century. Another technique was decoration with threads of glass of a different color worked into the main surface, and sometimes manipulated by combing and other effects. Gilded, painted and enameled glass were added to the repertoire, and shapes and motifs borrowed from other media, such as pottery and metalwork. Some of the finest work was in mosque lamps donated by a ruler, a wealthy man. His decoration grew more elaborate, the quality of the basic glass decreased, and it often has a brownish-yellow tinge, and is rarely free from bubbles. Aleppo seems to have ceased to be a major center after the Mongol invasion of 1260, and Timur appears to have ended the Syrian industry about 1400 by carrying off the skilled workers to Samarkand. By about 1500, the Venetians were receiving large orders for mosque lamps. Metalwork. Medieval Islamic metalwork offers a complete contrast to its European equivalent, which is dominated by model figures and brightly colored decoration in enamel, some pieces entirely in precious metals. In contrast, surviving Islamic metalwork consists of practical objects mostly in brass, bronze, and steel, with simple, but often monumental, shapes, and surfaces highly decorated with dense decoration in a variety of techniques, but color mostly restricted to inlays of gold, silver, copper, black and yellow. The most abundant survivals from medieval periods are fine brass objects, handsome enough to preserve, but not valuable enough to be melted down. The abundant local sources of zinc compared to tin explains the rarity of bronze. Household items, such as ewers or water pitcher, were made of one or more pieces of sheet brass soldered together and subsequently worked and inlaid. The use of drinking and eating vessels in gold and silver, the ideal in ancient Roman Persia as well as medieval Christian societies, is prohibited by the hadiths, as was the wearing of gold rings. One thing Islamic metalworkers shared with European ones was high social status compared to other artists and craftsmen, and many larger pieces are signed. Islamic work includes some three-dimensional animal figures as fountain heads or aquaman but only one significant enameled object is known, using Byzantine cloisonné techniques. The Pisa griffin is the largest surviving bronze animal, probably from 11th century Al-Andalus. More common objects given elaborate decoration include massive low candlesticks and lampstands, lantern lights, bowls, dishes, basins, buckets, and ewers, as well as caskets, pen cases and plaques. Ewers and basins were brought for hand washing before and after each meal, so are often lavishly treated display pieces. A typical 13th century ewer from Khorasan is decorated with foliage, animals and the signs of the zodiac in silver and copper, and carries a blessing. Specialized objects include knives, arms and armor, and scientific instruments such as astrolabes, as well as jewelry. Decoration is typically densely packed and very often includes arabesques and calligraphy, sometimes naming an owner and giving a date.